Welcome to Let's Talk Business. I'm your host, James Price. This podcast has been designed to address business pain points, often neglected, but if dealt with correctly, can really enhance business value and performance. I've had over 30 years experience in business, and I currently own JPO Business Proprietary Limited, a business valuation, advisory, and transaction firm. We help private business clients across Australia and internationally grow, change, and enhance the value of their businesses. Welcome to episode 8 of Let's Talk Business. I'm your host, James Price. Today we're in the home of Mark and Shari Reid, and my guest is Mark Reid. Mark's a racehorse specialist, racing industry specialist, sports betting specialist, and his sectors, he's had a career in sport, entertainment and leisure from my perspective, and a range of business pursuits. He's an entrepreneur and he's had a lot of success in building and changing and growing different business opportunities. It's great to talk to you, Mark.
Thanks, James. Good to see you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having us. It's exciting for me to have a chat with you. I mean, you've been a client of ours a few years ago when we've done a few valuations for you. But I've always enjoyed hearing about your pursuits. The racehorsing industry is a fascinating industry. How has it changed from today to when you first got involved in the industry?
Well, I suppose the biggest change is the corporatisation of the bookmaking industry. Yeah. So when I started in the industry back in 71 as a bookmaker, bookmaking was a sole trader business. You weren't allowed to have partners. And basically it was based on seniority. Promotion came from seniority. Over time there was this evolution that went through where there was a shift in promotion to the basis of performance. Then eventually opportunities came with advances in multimedia that you could grow the business by going into licensing, which gave you the opportunity to go online or use telephones. By the way, telephones have been well in play from way back with telephone betting by SP bookmakers, right back in the years in 1940s and before. Yeah. But that was all barred because they wanted to create in all the states of Australia a monopoly licence for the tab call or the tote. Yeah. The tote run by government, yes, which eventually was privatised in all states. Yeah. So we had the emergence of companies like Tabcorp, and they enjoyed a monopoly. And the idea of the industry was that they wanted to put the bookmakers in the closet and have a monopoly operating where they could generate the biggest funds.
Yeah, okay.
And we rallied against that, especially as a young bookmaker emerging. I'm talking about in the 70s and 80s when I was 21 when I got my first licence. And I understood racing, I understood the people that bet, I understood the psychology, and I warned the industry that this idea of a monopoly operator, it was not going to be good in the long term. And it wasn't until I had to go to the Northern Territory in 95, the end of 95, and create a bookmaking company and find a jurisdiction that allowed me to offer services to clients which they needed in a convenient place, that is, from home. Yeah. And in the first phase, that was purely done by telephone.
But that was far-reaching, right? Like that was very unique to be able to bet at home, in the time.
Exactly.
Right? We take it for granted today because we can use any device, I guess, to do our betting. But back in those days,
they were allowed to bet with Tabcorp, not with the bookmakers. They try to keep the bookmakers isolated on the racetrack. Yeah. But the racetrack had lost its appeal to many people. Yeah. There are major competing forces like football. Sydney had its rugby league growing. Yes. Of course, in Australian Football League, it became a major force. Cricket was always a major force.
Yeah.
So racing was once Australia's national sport.
Yeah.
Bigger than cricket, bigger than football.
Yeah.
But it lost its way, and a lot of the reason for that losing its way, in my mind, was the short-sightedness of the administration.
So you saw that opportunity and moved and set up a company in Darwin to pursue that opportunity, right?
Correct. Well, my first engagement was in the ACT,
Right.
and I'd done a joint venture with Tanjong PLC, which was one of Malaysia's biggest companies. Its managing director and major shareholder, Nanda Krishnan, was a friend of ours.
Yeah.
And we had a vision about creating an Australian-based Asian betting hub using internet technology, multimedia technology, which Ananda was a specialist in, having built the biggest multimedia centre in the world outside of America in KL.
Right. Right.
And we got a 25-year licence granted by the ACT government, the Labor government. There was a political storm in the middle of an election.
Yeah.
Labor got rolled. Kate Kurnell became the new premier, and her first step was to cancel our licence.
Right. Okay.
No vision, same old story. Was driven by local interests in terms of local bookmakers. Even though I said that we would not take any bets out of the ACT,
They still didn't want the license. Then.
they still were pressured by privatised TAB. They didn't want any competition.
Yeah.
And we would have hosted the biggest industry possibly in the world, I would suggest, if that went through.
Right.
In frustration, I then moved to the Northern Territory.
Right.
I found a willing partner who had a vision like mine in Barry Coulter, the treasurer.
Right.
Barry Coulter is one of the most famous Territorians still today.
Yeah.
And he and Marshall Perrin, the Chief Minister, could see the opportunity as I explained to them.
Yeah.
And that began the corporate bookmaking licence
Right.
in '96, and we went corporate. We went a licence that wasn't bestowed on an individual, but bestowed on a company.
Yes. Yes.
Now that industry today, we're talking now that the bookmaking industry out of Darwin is the biggest force in Australian wagering.
Right. And that business at the time, if you look at today, is that essentially Sportsbet?
Sportsbet's a major player. Sportsbet is owned by a company called Flutter that was eventually which morphed out of an Irish company called Paddy Power PLC.
Yes.
And I knew the people in Paddy Power well. They were actually Irish bookmakers who I knew well.
Right.
And at the stage when I decided to retire out of bookmaking, which is 2010, 2009, I said to Tabcorp, you should buy me out, because if I don't have any luck with you buying us out, we will then go to the UK and we will introduce a new wave of bookmaking to Australia, and they will come and they will compete with you guys with deep pockets.
Yeah.
And basically, that you are, by virtue of allowing them in through acquiring our company, you are giving them the beachfront into Australia with a walk-up start.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they didn't even come and do due diligence, such was their arrogance. Now we have a situation where Sportsbet, the company we sold it into,
Yes.
owned by Paddy Power, is bigger than Tabcorp.
There you go. Yeah. And if you reflect on the industry today, and I want to go back to the start, right? Because I think there's some, I'd really like to understand those early days that you had in the industry. But before we do, if you reflect on the shape of online betting and the horse racing industry, let alone the broader online sports betting industry today, there's a bunch of stuff that you did as a forerunner around technology and changing the way, the punter looks at it, I think. Is there not?
Yes, well, over the years I established a relationship with Kerry Packer through him being a punter and I'm being a bookmaker, both high profile.
Yeah.
So we would engage, and Kerry became when I moved to Sydney in 1980, he was very helpful to us. He started being with me in 1976 when he came down to Melbourne for the Melbourne Cup Carnival.
Yeah.
By the time we got to Wadey, we'd done a lot of things together in terms of betting. Yeah. And on arrival in Sydney, he was very kind to both Shari and I in establishing introductions in Sydney, automatic memberships of golf clubs and the like. There was no wait when Kerry was around. He just said, put him in. And basically, he owned Sky Channel. And Sky Channel was the way in which you could use satellite television. Yeah. And I'd been travelling to England for 25 years, every English summer for 25 years in a row. And I understood completely the whole English and UK betting industry. And I knew all the players in companies like Coral, William Hill, Ladbrokes. And I was learning a lot from these guys when I visited there. Yeah. So when I came back, I understood what they were using in terms of satellite communications. And I said to Kerry, I want to create a satellite communications on your platform. And we created a product called Read Rating.
Yes.
And we put Read Rating through Kerry's satellites into 500 venues around Australia.
Really? Wow.
In pubs and clubs.
Yeah.
And we provided all the content on screens. And I pinched all the ideas out of SIS, a company the bookmakers in the UK had. So great invention is not necessarily what it seems. Sometimes you're just poaching off other people's ideas, which I did unmercifully.
Well, that's very modest in a way, but I mean, I often say, if I reflect on elite business people or people that, do things in an elite manner, they're A-grade students in their industry. And my sense is you had an infection for finding out what was going on and seeing if you could apply it to a positive end. Is that sort of how you got to it?
That's a good summation. I was always interested in evolving technologies. Yeah. I remember back in the early 90s, my new thing was neural networks. And I figured if I could master the technology of neural networks, it'll save me doing all this laborious form all the time. and I'll have more time to play golf. New South Wales or Australia. Yeah. Yeah. Which was getting hard to do given we were trying to cover the whole of Australia with our database. So basically, yes, you have to be competitive. You must be ahead of the game. You must adopt new technologies, otherwise you get left behind. So when you think about that, I was a bookmaker for what are we talking now, for 40, since 1970 to 2010, that's 40 years.
Yeah.
And I had stayed at the top of the game that whole period, whether it be Melbourne or Sydney. It was by pure innovation. I had to evolve, and the industry at the same time was evolving at the same time. There were new competing forces.
Did you often feel, though, in that process that you were like the salmon running against the stream, or was it more like a running race where you and your fellow competitor bookmakers were all running at the same target? It was just that some were running harder than others. Like, what was it? There wasn't any competition when I first went to Darwin, per se, except for Centrebet. And the competition was local because Centrebet was owned and run by a great entrepreneur from Alice Springs, and Terry Lillis, his name was. Right. Terry Lillis has passed now, but he was one of the greatest innovators I'd seen. He created a business called Centrebet, which specialised on sports betting. Yeah. And it was a major sports betting business.
we were most focused on horse racing, and we also provided betting services, especially we evolved into betting on soccer into Asia.
Right.
But basically, as you were saying, it was always trying to keep ahead of the game. I think our business was the third bookmaker in the world to transact online,
Wow.
bets online in 1998 for the Soccer World Cup.
Mark, that's amazing.
So, but once again, it was about being aware of what emerging technologies.
Yeah.
The things I found that I could reinvent myself and retain relevance was by doing that. Yeah. So the read rating service was how that was positioned was I would give guidance to all the punters around Australia on screens in pubs and clubs.
Yeah.
And it gave them a winning chance. And I actually ran to promote the scheme and prove its worth. We ran a trade during the Melbourne Cup period for the Victor Cheng Heart Foundation at St Vincent's in Sydney.
Yeah.
And in a space of 1 month, we generated $185,000 worth of revenue, which in those days was a lot of money. Yeah. In fact, it was the highest ever individual grant that St Vincent's had received at that time.
Yeah.
So that created we got a lot of publicity through that.
Yeah. John
Hardigan was the at that stage who finished up being the managing director and chairman of News Limited in Australia.
Yeah.
He was at that time the editor of the Sportsman newspaper.
Yeah.
And he gave me a lot of license. He gave me a full page in the Sportsman every week, which I'd create stories in and that are relevant to betting. And to the chagrin of Tabcorp and New South Wales DAB that hated that. So when you're talking about headwinds, all the headwinds were caused by Tabcorp or Tab Limited,
the bigger
the companies who wanted to retain their monopoly. Yeah. They hated us in Darwin. And of course, they would be able to make waves with the ministers in their jurisdictions and made life impossible. But I had Barry Coulter. And Barry Coulter, the minister up in the Northern Territory, he's no shrinking violet. And when he'd go down to ministerial meetings, he would give as good as he got.
I'm interested. There's two aspects I want to test there. You know, like, I mean, with any innovation, technology particularly, but all sorts of innovation or doing things differently, even if they've been done before but not in the same market, there's a risk, right? But it seems to me that, you know, you mentioned rating. It seems to me you were bringing something to the end customer, so in a way there, because you were helping the punter enjoy their experience, right, effectively. So if I'm, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but so to do that as a business owner, running that and making sure your innovation's successful, you obviously, you know, you sort of need to put yourself in the shoes of the punter, I guess. Is that how
well, we took a lot of pride in the product. We knew the product was sound, and it would keep the punter alive in the venues that receive the product.
Yes.
So we showed them how they should bet and when they should bet, as well as giving them the content, the actual data, which was streamlined to an end result. What we found was we charged each licence holder, each pub, $3,000 a year, $60 a week. Yeah. And basically the deal was that if we couldn't double your turnover on the back of installing this thing, we give you your money back.
Yeah.
So we had 500 licenses paying us $3,000 each. Wow. It was a bit of money in the day. The costs, we absorbed the costs because we were going to carry those costs anyway. Yeah. And the deal I did with Kerry, as far as using the platform of Sky, it was a mate's rates deal, right? Yeah. Now you talk about what happens with those innovations and what can destroy what is a good product. Of course, Kerry decides to sell Sky Channel to Tabcorp. Yeah. So what's the first thing Tabcorp does? It says, you're out, man. Yeah. That's the first thing they did. Yeah. They pushed the product, a very good product, and then they try to copy the product. Yeah. and they try to create their own multimedia, content-driven screens.
Yes.
And they took 4 years to try and get a product which was substandard.
Yeah.
In the meantime, to show you how much better our product was, Crown Casino was building a huge sports bar, and Rowan Craigie, who became the chief executive of Crown, he decided that our product was way ahead of Tabcorp's, and he installed on all their screens in Crown Casino our screens.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, I want to come back to the other aspect, and that is, I sense in hearing you talk, there's a lot of relationships built there, right?
Racing's about relationships, James.
Is it?
Racing, the greatest thing about racing in the golden period, and the biggest disappointment of being an online bookmaker, is you lose interaction with your customer.
Yes, yes.
So imagine a situation, if you would, where every client, every punter at the racetrack would engage with you personally.
Yes.
So during the 70s and 80s, I knew every punter on the racetrack.
So that was what it was like. Right?
Yeah. And even if you're in the public, regular customers would come up and you engage every day.
Yes.
And you had a massively broad spectrum of people betting with you. There'd be gangsters betting with you, there'd be prime ministers betting with you,
Yes.
there'd be leaders of industry, there'd be stockbrokers, and they're all at the racetrack in that period to get the inside mail.
Yes.
Because the racetrack was important to be on the racetrack to get the right tips. So that's why people went to the racetrack. They congregated together because that's where you'd find the inside mail. And you needed to have inside mail.
Yes.
In those days too, all markets worked on inside mail. Today it'd be scandalous.
Yes. Yes.
But inside trading was the name of the game in the 70s.
Yeah.
Stock market everywhere.
Yes.
And if you weren't getting the inside mail,
you weren't in the game.
You weren't going to get a job as a stockbroker. No one's going to go near you. You know?
Yeah.
Well, on the racetrack, the most important person on the racetrack, no matter if you're a High Court judge, a QC, Bob Hawke or anything, they all would engage. Bob Hawke used to love going to the races, of course. Kerry Packer,
Yes.
Rupert Murdoch,
Yes.
they'd all be at the races. And basically, they'd all interested in one thing, finding out who had the best tips. And he or she became the major player on the racetrack.
Yeah.
No matter, she could have been a madam at a brothel.
Yeah.
It wouldn't make any difference. She was the person to go to get the right tips.
Yeah.
That's why she probably had the tips. and basically, they became the VIP of the racetracks.
Yeah. Was that ever a heavy weight on your shoulders, being a bookmaker in that environment?
In that environment, I never regarded it as being a heavy weight because I thought I was playing, and the way my mentality was, and the nature of the business in those days, was this was a giant sport. But not only a sport
for you?
For me, but not only a sport for the sport of racing and racing horses, which I did on a very large scale later on as I acquired some money. But the sport of going there and competing with the other bookmakers.
Yes.
People used to always think that a bookmaker competes with a punter. No, the punter is your asset.
Yes.
You engage the punter, and Shari and I we were very successful in Melbourne because we took hospitality to another level. That is, we had a property, a farm, and we would every Sunday, because there was no racing on Sunday, so very civilised, and every Sunday we would have a party, a gathering at the farm, and invite clients to the farm. Yeah. Free drink, free food, all the best. And then, of course, when I saw these people at the racetrack the following week, and if they went to a bookmaker next to me and had a bet with him rather than me, I'd say, didn't I give you good enough wine last week? So people this is a whole thing about
getting... So it's part of the relationship, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So basically, through that relationship, you form all these sort of interesting liaisons with people with a wide spread of industry. Yeah. And basically, people love meeting people from, diversity. People want to meet other people. Yeah. That was what the racetrack was about. They could meet on the, it's just a magical place in those periods. And unfortunately today, we just don't have that sort of
physical connection. Yeah.
And that was so important in my learning process. Opportunities came, you talk about opportunities coming along, you're made aware of opportunities because we would do, in the first phase, we went into syndicates of owning stud farms and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But we had more fun as a group owning the stud farm than you would have as owning it in your own right.
Yeah.
The same thing happens with racehorse ownership. Racehorse ownership was only allowed you weren't allowed to have, most racehorse was owned by one or two people, mostly one person.
Yeah.
These days, people own
a myriad of syndicates.
Well, exactly, and they own a hair in the tail. But so what?
Yeah.
You get more fun, and you can spread your risk.
Why did you get into racing horses originally, as punting, but focused on horses? What was there in your younger years? Was there some affinity or passion for that over other sports, I guess?
Well, in my reading in my early 20s, I was besotted by international racing as well as Australian racing.
Really?
I used to read books, all the books on breeding and horse husbandry, and then being involved in a stud farm opportunity came along as a 10% shareholder in a syndicate.
Yeah.
And we lived on the farm. We lived on the farm because the other partners, who were all leaders of industry in Melbourne, they wanted young people to put on the parties for them. They didn't want to live on the farm. So Shari and I got the gig, and we got
You were the hosts.
We were the hosts, and we loved it. We loved that situation.
Yeah.
But basically, the industry was awakening to me by I was flying out magazines from America and England, flying it by flight mail, so I could be up to date. And these magazines, like in America, the Blood Horse, was about that thick, on glossy paper, fantastic stories, and I learned a lot about new ideas.
Yeah.
So there was a group called Dogwood Farms that they introduced into America syndication of racehorses.
Yeah.
So once again, I stole that idea out of the Blood Horse, right? And I created the first syndicate company in Australia. You had to get a trust deed, went through all this process, and the chap, bus-stock agent in Melbourne, who I respected and worked for us, Anthony Kavanagh, I made him the manager of the Mark Reed Racing Company, and I bought stables. I bought the stables of Bart Cummings, the very famous stables, the best stables in Flemington, in 1978. And I bought these stables and redeveloped the stables, and it accommodated 40 horses.
Wow.
And basically then I got a private trainer from Queensland, the leading trainer in Queensland, Henry Davis. And I lived my dream. The dream was that I could own horses, and that dream came out of my first ever race horse, which I bought at a used horse sale.
Yes, yes.
And this horse, Aim High, I was living in the Macedon Ranges, and my vision was I wanted to win the Hanging Rock Cup.
The Hanging Rock Cup.
The Hanging Rock Cup is right near the Macedon Range. Hanging Rock's very famous.
Yes, it is.
For the movie. And the Hanging Rock is a beautiful race course, little picnic race course, and I wanted to win that cup. So I went and bought from a tried horse sale, the horse.
Aim High.
And that was well named, Aim High. And he won the Hanging Rock Cup. Well, that night, I was in London at the time when it won the cup, because I was buying some brood mares for the stud farm. And I dreamt that night I won the Melbourne Cup. So I had to live the dream. So I went chasing after that Melbourne Cup. But the business model for mine was betting focused. So I understood that I had such a network around Australia in logistics. You talk about logistics, how important that becomes in business. That I learnt that to be successful in betting, you had to have logistics to get your money down. If I wanted to have big bets, after a while I couldn't get them settled in one particular market.
Yes.
I needed a group of markets to spread the money.
So you needed diversity.
Yeah. So we, through that situation, I worked out I can get back in 1978, 1980, I can get $100,000 back in those days, which today's money would be, equivalent to a minimum of $500,000.
Yeah.
I can get these on a maiden. I can get a horse, train horses, get them ready to win one race, a maiden, even though they qualify for a much better class.
Yes.
But if I hold them back and just present them in the maiden with the right trainer and the right jockey, that I can get 100,000 on, and the money I could win on that race will be more than winning the Melbourne Cup.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was a business model.
So, and was it a business to you in those days, or was it still sport? Or is it both?
It had to be a business because the costs of running the stable and the stud farms and the contract for Henry Davis and all the staff. I brought down with Henry 3 highly qualified track riders, great horsemen, pinched them off Mick Dittman, the famous jockey.
Oh, really? Wow.
Mick Dittman was the leading jockey in Brisbane, and he was the jockey for Henry Davis.
Yeah.
Henry Davis had very poor communication skills, but not with horses. He'd rather talk to a horse than a person. And he was a gun trainer, and Mick told me he was a gun trainer. But when he came, he said to me, I'd be better if I had these jockeys who can ride the horses work. They're not jockeys per se.
Yeah.
They're too heavy to be jockeys, but they're the best riders. They can hold the horse on the track.
They know what to do.
And make them relax.
Yeah.
Right? So Mick had these guys lined up in Brisbane, Mick Dittman, because he didn't want any other jockeys getting on their horses. So he had always himself to ride horses with 2 or 3 other guys who would ride the other horses he couldn't ride. So I pinched them as well, and they came around. We created this model which was unbelievable. We landed plunge after plunge after plunge.
Of successful.
And that paid for the stables.
Yeah.
But they had to be big plunges, and we were winning. In that time, we had 2 plunges that netted over $1 million.
Wow.
Back then. Getting closer and higher signal. They were my 2 biggest plunges.
And was that all helping your bookmaker business effectively?
Well, then by that stage, that was during that time we moved to Sydney in 1980.
Yes.
And the bookmaking business was interesting in terms of different psychologies in different places.
Yeah.
This tells you a lot about the difference between Melbourne society and Sydney society.
Yes.
So in Melbourne society, there was no problem with the fact that I was a leading bookmaker in Melbourne, that I was recognised as having probably a superior database than anyone else, even though I was in my late 20s. That was part of the whole success story.
Yeah.
But there was no problem with me if I offered a price that was over the market. Everyone just knew it was my opinion, and they were happy to bet against my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah.
When I went to Sydney, that's how I started off again. I offered a better price than the rest of the market to attract business.
Yes.
Then after a while, after success in Sydney with the plunges and everything else, the attitude of the market was, why would you want to bet against him? He knows what's going to happen. And I was betting on Melbourne racing on the interstate.
He knows too much.
And Bruce McHugh, who was a fantastic bookmaker and really a fantastic horse racing person, he was my nemesis in Sydney because I was so jealous of him. He used to be the biggest bookmaker, and even though we worked next to each other, his turnover was 4 times more than mine.
Wow.
Not double, 4 times.
Really?
Because he was so clever, he went to all the punters in Sydney and said, don't bet with Mark Reed, you're never going to beat him. Yeah. At least you've got a chance against me.
He's too good.
And he conned them. And therefore, punters stopped betting with me. If I offered a better price, they just walked away from it.
Yeah.
So how was I going to get business? And Bruce, and I used to get frustrated with Bruce, and we'd have run-ins on the track, and I'd get called before the stewards for abusing Bruce, but that was all part of the theatre of the game, you know. Yeah. But I've got to grant to Bruce, he was the greatest bookmaker I'd seen ever operate.
If you had your time over...
Not because of what he, as a bookmaker, he understood how to deal with the client.
Very clever.
But he knew how to nullify the opposition.
So if you had your time over again in the Sydney market, would you have done it any differently, or was he just too formidable to...
Well, in frustration, I moved across to the locals to get away from Bruce.
Yeah.
Because if I go on locals, at least on the locals, they'll say, well, there'll be other guys there. They won't be... The marketplace won't be thinking I just know how Melbourne works so much better than they do.
Yeah.
But on Sydney, we found the same thing, because the psychology of the Sydney punters was that you had to be in the know. This came from a long culture of the Sydney racing history, where there was a lot of what should I call it, inside trading going on.
Yeah.
And you had to be in the know before you bet.
So was it hard to break into that market initially, or not really, for you?
Well, it was the first day I worked in Sydney. I had on one side, the AJC, the Australian Jockey Club, gave me a licence on the rails, first up. It caused a lot of controversy. I came in from Melbourne, a 30-year-old, walked in on the middle of the rails.
Yeah.
On one side, I had Ray Hopkins, who was the biggest punter, professional punter that I've ever seen in my time.
Right.
And a hell of a nice guy, and Ray's still alive, and he was always one of my heroes as a young guy growing up. I knew him since I was about 16, coming to Melbourne. He used to go to Melbourne often. And on the other side, I had Robbie Waterhouse.
Oh, really?
Robbie Waterhouse was I think Robbie's about 2 or 3 years younger than me, 3 years perhaps.
Right.
And so we're young Turks. So this is the first baptism of fire. And Robbie's a prince, because his father, Bill Waterhouse, was the king of bookmakers in Sydney for many years,
Yeah.
and imbued in the culture of Sydney gambling, which meant you had to know what you're doing. You'd have to know the inside goings on,
Otherwise, you'd trip and you wouldn't get up again.
Yeah, and there are all sorts of different camps.
Yeah.
In those days, because of this idea of, I call it, inside trading, there were camps. Different camps had different stables they were organised with, and different commission, and different bookmakers and punters would all join under the same tent.
Yes.
And they'd be in bitter opposition with other tents,
Yeah.
So a guy like Ray, he'd have a different, Ray Hopkins, he'd be in a different camp than Waterhouse would be in a different camp, and perhaps, or whatever, sometimes they mix, who knows. But Robbie was educated. He was getting taught the modern way of doing things, that is a form-based situation, as I was. Dominic Byrne was coming up at the same time. He was form-based. Well, so we had a new era, not based on inside information, but based on intellectual property.
Yeah, okay.
So this was the evolution going on. Once again,
Changed from fiction to fact, so to speak.
it did. It changed from a situation where you had to do your analysis, you had to be understanding. At the same time, you could never beat a situation where you got an advantage because you know this horse is going to try and this horse is not going to try.
Yeah.
No matter how good your form is.
Yeah.
But we didn't. We could sense that, having done the work, done the database work, done the analysis of the races in a very sophisticated way, we could then go to the marketplace and read the market to tell us whether they're on the ball or not.
Yeah. Okay.
In those days, you had to know these things. Today, you don't have to know these things because everything's...
It's systematised, so to speak.
The marketplace does not expect that there's going to be skullduggery.
No.
But in that period back then, the marketplace was very different. It was a massive evolution going on through my time.
Did that suit you, do you think? Like, were you...
It suited me. Self-interest is a great motivator. And when I remember this, my mother was a very big punter.
Yes, I recall you telling me that once.
Yeah, and my mother was, even to this day, my mother is regarded and recognised as the biggest woman punter Australia's ever seen.
Is that right?
Yeah. And so she, but she was, she didn't do the form per se, but she had access to the best information because she was a great commission agent, because she was a female. Now, in the period in the 60s and 70s, it was her time.
Yes.
So in that time, she would approach the bookmakers from the outside enclosure, not from the members, because women weren't allowed in the members.
Amazing, isn't it?
No way. Women were allowed to be in the Holy of Holies, where the men would congregate and get their inside information.
Yeah.
Women were kept out of there.
Outside.
So she had to do all her trading from the public side, right? So when she approached a bookmaker, or her agents approached a bookmaker, and she was betting, especially she was better, they would treat her agents like dismiss them
But
and
that-
tell them to go on. But if she approached them,
They'd take it seriously.
a man in those days would see, in those days, imagine this, a man could never be seen to knock back a woman having a bet with you. So she'd walk up and she'd say 10,000 to 5,000, and the bookmaker would only want to bet a 2,000 or 1,000, but she'd take the bet.
Yeah.
If a man walked up and asked for 10 to 5,
They'd say, "Oh,
you can have 4 to 2, something like that,
So they couldn't refuse it.
She was a very effective commission agent, and therefore also she had friends in the industry, and and my father used to run SP bookmaking and were commission agents
Right.
in the 50s.
Yeah, right.
So she had a network of people that were really in the know that used to bet in the old SP days. Imagine this, people today can't imagine this. This was before TAV.
Yeah, exactly.
And every pub and every club had an SP bookmaker.
Yeah.
Everyone sitting at home listening to Burt Bryant on 3UZ, the race caller, who, by the way, had a listening audience of 25% of the Australian population every Saturday afternoon.
Is that right?
The biggest media audience ever known in Australian history, but they all listened to him on the races and Cliff Carey in Sydney, but they also had on the phone a bookmaker they could bet with,
Yeah.
or go up the pub behind the pub in the lane.
So it was a really ingrained part of local leisure, or community leisure, wasn't it?
It was a
And
national
entertainment.
sport.
Yeah.
The national sport, and people think about football every day at the races, every Saturday. There was a minimum, say Moonee Valley only held 25,000 people. Well, Moonee Valley Race Club in Melbourne was full to the rafters every Saturday race there.
Yeah.
There were bigger crowds at Caulfield and Flemington. Yeah. But the crowds of football, AFL football, Richmond Football Club, if you're familiar in Melbourne, Richmond where the ground is.
Yes.
If you drive through Hoddle Street next door to it, the boundary line can only accommodate 3 people deep. The maximum crowd at Richmond Football Club was 3,000 people.
Yeah. So that was the difference.
That's the difference.
Yeah.
And we had a situation where racing, as we spoke about before, was a national sport, and also everyone went there. They didn't go to football.
Yeah.
Football wasn't social. There were no socialites running football clubs.
Yes.
The football clubs were run by football tragics.
Yeah.
And by normal people.
But racing was a full relationship social event.
Exactly, it's where you had to be seen, but more importantly, where you got the information to be a punter and get the thrill of winning with a bit of thing in your favour. Yeah. Everyone loves something in their favour, right?
And you talked about your mum. I mean, what did you learn most from your mum in terms of reflecting on your career in those early days, do you think?
Well, if anyone asks me that question, I've got the immediate answer straight comes to my mind, was her main maxim, which was drummed into us when we were young. She used to say, never educate a mug, nor cheat a friend.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So what's that mean to young people? I say, what's that mean? Well, the idea was that if you educate a mug will get up and you educate him. That mug will get up and emerge, and once you're a mug, you're always a mug. Yeah. And he'll emerge, and one day he'll come up and do you over one day. Yeah. So don't even go there. And then the worst other thing you can do is cheat a friend.
Cheat a friend.
But that meant I used to think that meant that anyone else was fair game.
And that's why you played sport in the early days, I guess, like in terms of...
Yeah, well, you played sport, and this is the thing which is, you've got to be as old as I am to reflect back this way and understand at the time, think about what was motivating you to be the person you were in business or anything else. In the 60s, as a teenager, in Melbourne, you were very much, or a lot of us, certainly I was, very much involved in Australian rules football, or VFL in those days. And the coaches in the teams used to get up there, and there was a model for how you should coach and inspire people and how you should perform. Yeah. And it was take no prisoners attitude, kill or be killed, I remember growing up, and there used to be a guy that played centre half back, Ray Guy for St Kilda, captain of St Kilda. And when they bounced the ball in the middle, as you see on the TV these days, his role was the shirt front, whoever the most important player the other team was to run straight through him.
Take him out.
With a shirt front,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And he could do mortal damage. He was such a good shirt fronter, you know?
Yeah.
But that was the name of the game.
Yeah.
Whatever it takes was the name of the game.
Yeah. And on reflection, was that the right way to play it?
No, because you learn, you know, it's a funny thing about life. You can understand when people are getting out of the ghetto, what they need to do to survive with their families and everything else.
Yes.
You've got to give them a fair bit of leeway. Given that I grew up in Fitzroy in the slums,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. And we ran the SP in Fitzroy, but no one had any real money. Running the SP in those times was, you know, you're dealing in, when I went to school and went the other side of the Yarra and went to a place like, I went to school in Toorak, I used to just look at the houses there and just shake my head.
With amazement, yeah.
I remember coming home to Fitzroy one day from school at St Kevin's, and I think I was in grade 6, and I came home and I'd just been to Simon Hanger, who eventually became the school captain in my class. I'd been to his house in Caulfield, and he had a tennis court in the backyard. And I came home and I said...
Not in Fitzroy, it was.
I said to my parents, you know, Simon's got a tennis court in his backyard. Only years later did he tell me that it wasn't his tennis court, that the neighbour was a tennis coach, and he took me into his tennis court. But I'm saying, you know, you were full of aspirations. So what I learnt as a young person, that I wanted those things. I wanted to come out and you know, you wonder why sportsmen in the world come out of those sort of classes, because they aspire. They'll do the work to get there, you know.
Yes, yes.
If you have an easy upbringing, the motivation to go to the next yard is not there.
And is it just motivation, or to get there, is it more than motivation? I mean, you've got to have the motivation, as you say.
Yeah.
If you don't have the motivation, you know, you're not going to take steps, right?
It's the evolution of you as a person too.
Yes.
That once you get to a certain level and you start to think deeper. When you're young, it's all about the win.
Yeah.
But then you start to understand what you should do is develop some nobility.
Yeah.
Nobility. To be a noble person is to understand there could be repercussions for me going and having the attitude of whatever it takes.
Yes.
And so I've got to temper that. And if you're a person of means, and you still go down the same previous path you may have used to get where you are, I think that basically, you know, you haven't evolved as a person, and you should look at yourself deeply, you know, because basically one should look after others if able. Certainly in Fitzroy we did. In Fitzroy, when I grew up, right, whoever had the money put on the show.
Yes.
So people would come and go, and it wouldn't make any difference if the person put on the show had the money. He might have been a thief.
Yeah.
He might have been
but he would put it on
if he had the money,
he had the means.
He had the means, and if people didn't have the means, they would go along and they would get accommodated, right? So in my whole youth growing up, there were guys who did well out of our group, out of our family group and some of their friends.
Yes.
And what I saw these people do, one particular guy became the biggest force in trotting in Victoria.
Really?
And but he used to have, he built the biggest rumpus room and bar in Melbourne, in a house in Northcote.
Yeah.
This guy came out of commission flats in Fitzroy.
Really?
A Greek guy, Greek family, lived there with his mother until he got married. He didn't get married till he was 35 or 40. He went and bought the house in Northcote, bought the house next door, pushed it over, and built on the site, built a rumpus room and bar.
Yeah.
And every Sunday it was open house.
Yeah.
And all the knockabouts would come.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
To that house. And these included knockabout guys like famous guys in Melbourne.
Yes.
Lindsay Fox's brother, Donny Fox.
Yeah.
These guys were great friends with Peter. This guy was called Peter the Greek because he's a Greek guy. And he would have these open houses. Now, this place was so famous, became so famous, that people like Tom Jones, Shirley Bassey, they all went back there for the parties.
Yeah.
When they came to Melbourne,
that's where
they put on a show.
That would be the after party.
Yeah. And he would have the after party and invite them there. It's an amazing story. So that's where I grew up. That's how you have to understand that, you know, if you've got the money, it's your responsibility to pay for everyone else.
But that's a very different, feeling, I guess, versus people that perhaps had a more privileged upbringing. I'm not sure they would approach it in the same way, Mark.
No, you're correct. And I found that in life that not all people are the same. No. Not everyone came out of Fitzroy.
Yeah.
And now Fitzroy's upmarket. People say, oh, you know, everyone's so expensive in Fitzroy, and all the people have got money there. You know, wow. But it wasn't at that stage in the 50s, I can tell you that.
No.
So basically the people who are born with the silver spoon, usually in that period of time, came from families and just said acquire, and keep the others out.
Yes.
Conservatives.
Yes.
You can gather from my talk that I'm not big into conservatism. I don't believe in conservative. I didn't believe, for instance, when they had this rule about seniority, seniority in bookmaking promotion.
Yes.
When I came into it, I broke down all that glassware.
Yeah.
How do I do that? With the help of my mother, because my mother was friendly with the chairman of the VRC, Rupert Steele, and Rupert changed the rules and turned it into just in time for my emergence. You know. So basically, I think seniority and those sort of conservative values bring about corruption. Yeah. And they corrupt the whole system. Yeah. And basically I saw that. I saw the evolution of time. It distresses me now to see where the Australian economy and society is today. You know, we're back to my way of thinking. We're back to where we were in the 20th century.
Why is that?
The whole idea about the unfortunate disparity between the haves and the have-nots is not good for the economy.
No.
I mean, I studied economics at uni as well as science, so I did some economics after starting off in science at Melbourne, and basically economics intrigued me. Yeah. But in that stage, the name of the game was capitalism. Yes. But the distortion of capitalism we see today is stuffing up the whole bloody world.
Do you think, in other words, the real money is so concentrated with so few? Is that what you're getting at?
Correct. And so, you know, what happens, there was no one at the turn of this century, there may have been, in a place like Australia, there might have been one guy, probably Kerry Packer, who put his hand up to be a billionaire, right? Yeah. Now there is a multitude of them. And how's that be? Why do we have a situation today where, you know, middle-class people, upper middle-class people, that where the wife may be earning 200,000 plus and the husband might be earning 200,000, but these people still are struggling to find the money until to buy a home. Yeah. I mean, what the hell's going on here? Yeah. You know, we're talking about the wealth Australia has generated over the last 25 years, this century, is enormous. Yeah. We didn't go through any depression like any other country has, or recession.
No, we've had the longest run
of all time.
That's right.
Yet, you know, in that 25 years ago, you only needed one income per family, and you could buy any house you want.
Yeah, that's right. So there is a real disparity in that sense, isn't it?
It is, and it's not good for the economy. People don't understand. We understand that if you keep taking the people's money, they'll have nothing to spend, more to spend. They've only got a certain amount of money to spend, and that's what's in their pocket. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So the smart people. Interesting. I've watched the industry, the gaming industry in poker machine industry, and I watched this with interest to see what's the psychology of these people. You know, this mindless exercise in pushing a button and doing that thing they want to get that charge of winning the event. I mean, they'd be much better off being wagering. At least you've got some input there, you know.
Yeah.
But what I saw was this: that people want to have a outlet after work or whatever. They go and play the poker machines for an hour, right? However, the smart hotel keepers, what they did, instead of winding up the take,
Yes.
they wind it down the take, right? And I spoke to a hotelier about this some years ago, and he said, what I'm doing here, I've got my take half my competitors. He said, because I know my market only has a certain amount to spend,
Yes.
but it's going to take me twice as long to win that certain amount.
Yeah.
But guess what? If I keep them in my hotel and they arrive after work at 5 o'clock and they usually run out of money at 6 o'clock, if I can keep them till 7 o'clock and still in money, they're going to ring up their wife at 6 and say, I'm still going here, bring in the kids and we'll have dinner at the hotel. And then he said, I've got the household income as well.
Yeah.
Hotel keeper.
There you go.
Yeah.
Is it harder for young people in the environment you've talked about in Australia? You know, think of yourself as a young person in your mid-20s going into a business, like the business you went in or any other business. What have you got to be very different today to succeed, do you think? Or are they the same things that you faced?
It's a very different world today.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, James, as a previous banker, you'll love this story, that when I was emerging as a bookmaker, it was a shock to the system to engage with a person like Kerry Packer when I was 26, 1976, 77, right? So he comes to the Melbourne Cup period and he starts to bet, and he bets in large sums, which I haven't encountered before. So what I have to do is to manage the risk. So I have to take his bets to give him the service, then offload the bets with other bookmakers.
Yes.
So at the end of the week, he owes me $750,000, right? Cool. But I haven't won $750,000 net because I've got the money engaged everywhere else, right? To cut the liability down to a reasonable level. So at the end of the period, I'm waiting to get paid. Then Kerry rings me up and says, "Oh, no, I've got a bit of a cash flow issue." He said, "Mate," you know, I'll give you $250,000 now,
A down payment.
and I should have the rest of the money to you by next Easter or something, you know."
Mark Reed, ABC Bank, is it?
So, well, you know, which is, you know, I'm saying, well, it was no real issue except, hang on, I've had to pay out this money to other bookmakers, right?
Yeah.
So then what I did, I went to my bank manager, and I told the story to my bank manager, and the bank manager gave me a line of credit, right, for $500,000 on the back of the debt without any security.
Talk about cash flow lending.
Well, there you are. And that bank manager, you know him, he finished up being, at the ANZ Bank, he finished up being the managing director of the Adelaide Bank.
Adelaide Bank, yeah.
And he finished up being managing director of RACV Club in Melbourne, which is a big institution, right?
Yeah.
So that was the nature. If your bank manager in those days knew you and was confident in your thing, as you know, he could go to enormous lengths to help you out, right?
Yeah.
But that's all changed now, you know.
And that's tricky, right? Isn't it? Like, you know, we talked earlier about relationships, and you know, knowing you as I have, but also listening today, I can't but be awed by your database, your network, and the relationships. And I think, you know, I like your perspective on it, but, you know, for me, that's been a large part of your success over the years, I think. It's interesting today because, as you say, those relationships with the likes of financial institutions, it's all data-based and it's taken away from the individuals and the humans. However, you know, you then reflect on, you know, the fellow you said a quarter of the population was listening to them, right? And you think about YouTube, Instagram, followers, engagement, marketing, and the value of connections. Those issues are still very high in the sense of how businesses are valued and how successful they are.
Yes.
They're in a different guise, but the gems of all of that is still very, very relevant, isn't it?
It is. And, it's interesting you make that point, James, because my son, Alexander, he has a high executive position with Ladbrokes Australia and Ned's, right? And his job is all about relationships, right? So they have this idea that they engage all the time, where we missed out we were too far away, living up in Darwin, to engage the way I wanted to and get a better engagement and a better feeling out of my business.
Yes.
But now they do through that situation.
Yeah.
So he conducts all sorts of programs with different networks of people to engage their clients and give them a value-added experience in their dealings with Ladbrokes.
That's fascinating, isn't it? And I mean, often we're faced with, as you know, we value a range of different businesses, and often we're faced we peer in and look at the network and look at the database and look at the value of the intellectual property that the firm has. And, sometimes it's easy to value and sometimes it's hard to value, but it's a key element often a key element of the goodwill.
James, you cannot survive without intellectual property. The idea of developing your own intellectual property, no matter what, the definition of intellectual property can be one thing or another. It's a wide-ranging concept, but you have to maintain and continually develop that to keep ahead of the game.
Yeah.
So the only thing that keeps me going now, and I trade on Hong Kong, and basically I have, what do I do? I run small trading groups, only two I run, and they're sort of clients of mine over many years, and they want to keep betting. They don't win, but at least in Hong Kong with me they do win, right?
Yeah.
So they get a lot of engagement. We include them. We give them access directly to our trade. They can sit there watching the races, but also be part of the action. They can engage in the thing, and we find that amazingly successful in terms of what they're getting out of the exercise. They just don't want to sit there for the sake of the investment. They want to have some fun.
As well as the investment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So basically, exactly as we do. So all those things cannot be done unless you maintain the database. And I can't maintain my relevance as a 73-year-old unless I have best database and I've got technology which I can then engage other people around me, Otherwise, I'll become a total recluse. They already think I'm a recluse anyway. But basically, you can't do also. If I choose to be totally engaged personally in my database, which I am, which is keeps my mind active, basically I want someone to share that also, so that I can get some recognition. So you can't, like a dog. If you don't recognise your dog, he'll never be happy,
Yeah.
So,
but it's a dynamic thing, right?
It's a moving thing.
Yeah. And the Hong Kong market, you mentioned you're actively involved in the Hong Kong market, and I'm assuming that's weekly, Mark.
It's 2 race meetings a week, yes.
Yeah. And how did you get into that market? Like how long have you been punting in that market and working with that market?
I started betting in Hong Kong in 1988.
Wow.
1988, and I used to go to Hong Kong, and I liked their racing, and racing was very different there. The evolution in Hong Kong is amazing. It was so red hot back in those days, the racing, red hot. They used to, it was, a lot of jockeys would go from Australia up to Hong Kong, and next minute they'd come back to Australia with their tail between their legs, hunted out by the gangsters or the triads or whatever else.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Up to no good. In actual fact, in those days, the worst reputation in the 90s, the worst reputation of any jockeys in the world were the Australian jockeys.
Was that right?
It was very poor.
Yeah.
Anyway, they went there and whatever it takes to make money, you know.
Yes.
So basically that's all changed now. Hong Kong racing is the most regulated and best administered racing in the world. Everyone recognises that. No one even argues about that, right? Yeah. So I enjoy that situation. Complete transparency. I can watch every time a horse goes out to exercise, I can watch it on film on the Jockey Club website, right? Even if they swim, I know the horse having a swim. Yeah. Every veterinary treatment they get, I also know about that. Yeah. There's so much data that I'm getting out of that Jockey Club for free. Yet when Australia wants to sell data on horse racing, they want to charge the people for it. Can you believe it? How much greed is there in this Australian racing scene that they want to charge their major customer who provides all the capital for what they're all doing for these...
They want to charge them for basic data around how people are performing.
How the horses are
performing.
And they're not giving them the data anyway. Yeah. They're not giving them the fact that they've been treated for a bad cold and they're going to run 2 weeks' time. Yeah. Well, that horse is not going to run to its best, is it? But they're not giving that information. So basically, all this stuff in the modern sense, in the modern days of technology and data transfer, these things should be available to everybody. So Hong Kong provides that a medium which does that.
Yes.
And it's only twice a week, so we have a life as well. Although I still spend about a minimum of 45 hours a week on Hong Kong racing.
What do you love about it? Because you obviously love it.
Well, I love it because...
You're 73 and you're twice a week.
I love it because I'm good at it. And what's more, I'm back to being a sportsman like I was in my 20s. I regard this as being a sport, not a business. Yeah. And to me, I can keep the score. See, it's very important in business that one has consistency, you can keep the score, and it's repetitious in terms of going back to the same thing that you know all the time, right?
Yeah.
So in running a business, all those things about database and that are all correct. But you have to, first of all, have intellectual property. You have to be consistent in your application. You have to work and you have to keep a scoreboard.
Yes.
All those things are so... If you deviate from that, it's like a golfer playing golf and not keeping score, and then coming to the clubhouse and say, how did you play today? Oh, I played really well,
So as a business owner, if you're not keeping a scoreboard, you're just kidding yourself, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
And you have to have budgets. Yeah. You've got to have the rails for the scoreboard, the railings, to guide you along, especially. And then you won't know where you're going wrong unless you've got the scoreboard there. Yeah. So many people don't keep score, especially betting people. I can't believe how many betting people don't keep score. It's always been the way.
It's weird, isn't it?
If they knew their score, they wouldn't bet anymore, I suppose.
Is it because they don't trust themselves?
They want to know.
They don't want to know.
They don't want to know how much they're losing.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So they can write it off as a sport. But why not have a sport where you make a profit at the same time? Or at least negate bad losses anyway. So you can do that if you're keeping score and you're obviously doing something wrong. You have a checkpoint to say, hey, let's go back and review here.
Yes.
So you can, on my desk there, I've got records. I've got actually two containers full of material of all my scoreboards over the last 30 years in those containers.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You mentioned you're 73, which is not all that old in my book. You're looking well.
I tell you what, it's pretty old in my book.
Oh, is it? Well, you're keeping a score. But you're passionate, right? If you look back on those years that have passed, would you have done anything differently?
No, I've had a blessed life, and Sherry and I have been married for 50 years.
Yes,
this year.
I must say congratulations again by that. That's magnificent.
And anyone who could be engaged with me for 50 years, she must be some kind of saint,
Well, she is a special person. I can vouch for that, but not the same as you.
But basically, you have to ride the highs and the lows. If you're in the gambling industry, we talk about the glory. You only remember the glory days. The great thing about going back over past times is somehow the human being is able to wipe out the bad times and remember the good times.
Yes.
Right? So you must be a good storyteller and remember the good times. You must be a situation where, unless you've got a story, the racetrack blessed me with a host of stories.
Yes.
And I can categorise every story by putting it in a little slot with the year. So if you say to me, tell me a story about 1988, tell me a story about 1978, tell me a story about 1976, I'll tell you a story on every year. There'll be something in every year, and only racing can do that.
Yes.
Whereas I imagine if I was in a humdrum job, per se, and there would be nothing different, everything's going to be the same,
Yeah.
there's nothing going to stand out.
Yeah.
But there's always been a scandal, or there's always been a highlight, or there's always been something happening which tells me that was a year.
No, I mean, that's fascinating. And look, I just get so much energy and passion from you. I mean, one other aspect I'd like to reflect on is, if I think of my network and my database of people, you know, when I think of you, I think of a lot of different things, but and I don't know whether you associate this word with yourself, but in terms of someone that's a supreme promoter, I would put you in that bucket, right? In a sense that if someone's got an idea that's got legs, but they need some specialists around it to take it from here to reality, then I see you as someone who can marshal the team to make it work. Now that's testament to that database of yours, that networking and relationships, I think. Do you feel the same way?
That's the way to go. And one of the things which, one of the areas which I regret is that when we got into the corporate bookmaking scene,
Yeah.
and a public company scene, the whole exercise became so intense in terms of meeting the goals of the market.
Yes.
I mean, I would have, if my time was over again, I would have kept the company private.
Would you?
Because, and I'm going to say why, because the intensity of having to perform growth year on year on year on year was not a problem if I was had the tools available to me.
Yes.
So since I sold the company, Sportsbet, our company, into Sportsbet,
Yes.
Sportsbet has got all the people, the key people in that company, a lot of the key people in that company are still my people there,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Still today,
Yeah.
including the CFO and the head trader and that sort of thing, you know?
Yeah.
So basically, when you're getting older, this intensity of meeting the expectations and the headwinds that were put in my path, like restricting, we weren't allowed to market. They stopped us from advertising. But all those things, after I sold the company, 2 years later, all those restrictions were lifted. And you see I know the advertising gets a lot of press about the negative consequences of that
Yes.
situation.
Yeah.
But I know, for instance, that Sportsbet have been spending more than $100 million a year on promotion and advertising for the last 7 years.
Amazing, isn't it?
And 7 years ago, no one in the whole of Australia was spending $100 million a year on marketing like that. you
Nothing
know?
like it. No.
So basically, but they don't see it. Interesting about that, they don't see it as a dollar value. They see it as a percentage of their revenue.
Yes.
So if they have a budget which says we're going to spend to grow our business 15% of our revenue on marketing growth.
Yes.
Well, that's the model. The 15% of a growing base keeps growing and growing and growing.
So it's a bit like a percentage of revenue spent on research and development.
Exactly the same
instance.
thing.
Yeah.
So we all know in budgeting, and the thing about bookmaking, where I differentiated myself from many of my peers at that time, was that I understood through my education at uni, understanding the concept of budgeting,
Yes.
the concept of looking at of revenues from the point of view of what you spend on human resources, on IT and the like, and what they should be, and finding out in other successful bookmaking companies what they were doing.
Yeah.
And once again, I'm the best plagiarist of all time. I'm always pinching other people's ideas. Everyone used to think that he's got all these ideas. But no, it's just a matter of going out and seeing best practice and following suit.
And then trying to apply it directly to your situation.
Correct. So if you can get, as you're saying, if you can get access to good advice, like yourself, like I've used you, if I can get that, if anyone can get that access, you've got to employ that. It's a cheap spend.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you won't get to the places you need to go. You need to get to people with a broad experience in the various fields where you don't have the experience in.
Yeah. No,
Some of them, not even a winner. My neural networks never worked. I spent hundreds of thousands on neural networks that never worked.
Yeah.
But then again, just to digress, another story goes that back in the 80s, I got onto a academic who was the Deputy Vice Chancellor of the University of Western Australia. And we wanted computing power, and he was a physicist. Which I studied at University of Physics as well. And we had a chemistry between us on that. But he had an interest in horse racing.
Yeah.
So we built together a whole new rating model on horse racing where he could do the brain work and I had the input from the point of view of the horses. But to do that, guess what we used as our platform? We used the mainframe at the University of Western Australia every night. But these days we'd all be in jail.
but there you go, though. It's about marshalling advice, resources, relationships, people with specialist knowledge to deliver an outcome or fix a problem, isn't it?
Exactly. And mentors, another thing I should have touched on before, mentors are so important. I've been blessed with mentors like you can't believe. Even from the days when I was 10, 11, 12, even the guys like Peter the Greek and these guys I mentioned in the story, they're all mentors to me. My mother was a mentor. My mother married a second time to an ex-jockey. Couldn't ride to save himself, but it was a hell of a judge, a great judge of horseflesh. And he was a clocker at Flemington.
Yes.
In actual fact, he's regarded as a doyen of clockers at Flemington. Yeah. And he taught me how to do the form. And he taught me about keeping records on form. And basically, he was the greatest influence. His name was Lal Reed, spelled R-W-D. I'm R-E-A-D.
Really?
My mother
Wow.
married another Reed. But I've got no doubt in the world that my mother married him, not because he was such a great guy, but he could provide her with the intellectual property about picking the winners. I've got no doubt about that.
But I think, like mother, son can put the expertise together, right? And I think, like, just reflecting on your comment about mentors, how much of that was assisting you and tutoring you and mentoring you out of the goodness of their heart, those mentors, or how much of it was unlocked by the questions and the badgering that you might have given them to understand what knowledge they had? Yeah,
well, I was motivated big time because of my passion for racing.
Yeah.
So basically the passion was there and people will respond to that passion. If you show the interest, that people will mentor you. I'm happy to get a student anytime. Yeah. I'm happy to engage. If someone comes along to me today, tomorrow, and says to me, look, I'm vitally interested in horse racing, I really have the passion and I've done the necessary preamble to get to that level, right? I would embrace them.
Yes.
And because you want to find expression for what you've learned.
Yes. Yes.
So I suppose one of the things I noticed in my life at a very early age, when I was doing first year matriculation, I was down at St. Bede's at Mentone on boarding school. Yeah. I was hating boarding school. I'd been there for 3 years and I was hating boarding school. And I wanted to be out of that place doing first year matric. I had one teacher who I was friendly with. The teacher was a metallurgist.
Yes.
And he went back to school to be, he loved the school. He was former captain of the school, St. Bede's. John Roden, his name is. And John, he loved cricket. He was coach of the cricket team. So he and I were very friendly. I used to play cricket and he loved racing as his sport. So obviously we had this common interest. Anyway, first year matric, I failed every subject except physics. First class honour in physics.
Oh, really?
Right.
Oh,
So I went back to St Kevin's next year, which was my original school, to do second year matric and play sport, football and cricket. That's what you did in those days, second year matric for that reason. In the second year, I got a Commonwealth scholarship, 3 firsts and 2 seconds. so I just got to say, teachers, mentors. See, I was inspired by that teacher.
yeah, and I think that that says a lot, right? But it's a two-way street, right? You've got to show the passion to get the passion on both sides, probably.
Yeah, and you're exactly right.
Yeah.
That you show people. I think good people respond. They want to share.
Yes.
And and basically, then you've got to do the hard work. You've got to show that person who's your mentor that you're prepared to do the work and help give something back.
Yeah. Speaking about giving something back, you've given something back today. I don't want this to end, but you've been so generous with what you've talked about and your stories, Mark. I do appreciate you being our guest on Let's Talk Business today.
Great, James.
And thank you very much.
Thanks, James. Fantastic. Cheers.
So that was episode 8, and it's a wrap. And that was Mark Reed. And aren't we and weren't we fortunate to talk to Mark and to hear his stories about the racing industry, the horse racing industry, the betting industry, life, mentors, and how to make a business tick, but also how to be noble and share your experiences with others. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this podcast and follow us on Instagram at JamesC_Price. And if you're up for improving your business, gaining access to knowledge, insights, our team, and consultations, join our online membership portal. Visit jpabusiness.com.au.